Algebra, Arcanum and Transparence. The extent to which the 18th century, here marking a break-off point, attempted to comply with these two exigencies, is too often ignored or underestimated. If for profound and systematic reasons, the 19th century has left us a heavy heritage of illusions or misunderstandings, all that concerns the theory of the written sign at the end of the 17th and during the 18th centuries has suffered the consequences. Point 2. We must learn to reread what he has been thus confused for us. Madeleine B. David, one of those scholars who, in France, have untiringly kept alive the historical investigations of writing by watching over the philosophical question. 3 has just collected in a valuable work the pieces essential for a dossier of a debate exciting the passions of all European minds at the end of the 17th and all through the 18th centuries. A blinding and misunderstood symptom of the crisis of European consciousness. The first plans for a general history of writing, Warburton's expression, dating from 1742, for were born in a milieu of thought where proper scientific work had constantly to overcome the very thing that moved it, speculative praejudice and ideological presumption. Critical work progresses by stages and its entire strategy can be reconstructed after the fact. It first sweeps away the theological prejudice. It is thus that FNRET qualifies the myth of 76 Part 1, writing for the letter a primitive and natural writing given by God, as Hebrew script was for Blaise de Vigenère, in his trait de chiffres ou secrets manières d'escrire, 1586, he says of these characters that they are the most ancient of all, formed indeed by the Lord God's own finger. Asterisk in all its forms, overt or covered, this theologism, which is actually something other and more than prejudice, constituted the major obstacle to all grammatology. No history of writing could come to terms with it. And especially no history of the very script of those whom this theologism blinded, the alphabet, whether Greek or Hebrew. The element of the science of writing had to remain invisible within its history, and especially to those who could perceive the history of other scripts. Thus there is nothing surprising in the fact that the necessary descending followed the becoming legible of non-occidental scripts. The history of the alphabet is accepted only after recognizing the multiplicity of the systems of script and after assigning a history to them, whether or not one is in the position to determine it scientifically. This first descending is, itself, limited. It is recentered upon a historical grounds which, in an analogous way, reconcile the logico-philosophical, blindness to the condition of the logico-philosophical, phonetic writing, and the theological points of view. 5 It is the Chinese prejudice, all the philosophical projects of a universal script and of a universal language, facility, polygraphy, invoked by Descartes, outlined by Father Kircher, Wilkins 6 Leibniz, etc., encouraged seeing in the recently discovered Chinese script a model of the philosophical language thus removed from history. Such at any rate is the function of the Chinese model in Leibniz's projects. For him what liberates Chinese script from the voice is also that which, arbitrarily and by the artifice of invention, wrenches it from history and gives it to philosophy. The philosophical exigency that guided Leibniz had been formulated quite a few times before him. Among all who inspired him, Descartes himself comes first. Replying to Mercenet, who had sent him, from a publication unknown to us, an advertisement boasting a system of 6 propositions for a universal language, Descartes begins by declaring all his distrust. 7 He considers with disdain certain propositions which were, according to him, no more than sales talk and sales pitch. And he has a bad opinion of the word arcanum. As soon as I see the word arcanum, mystery, in any proposition I begin to suspect it. To this project he opposes arguments that are, one will recall those of Saussure. The discordant combinations of letters which would often make the sounds unpleasant and intolerable to the ear. It is to remedy this defect that all the differences in inflections of words have been introduced by usage, and it is asterisk quoted in M.B. David, Op. Cit. p. 28n. R01 Grammat% as a positive science. 77 Impossible for your author to have avoided the difficulty while making his grammar universal among different nations, for what is easy and pleasant in our language is coarse and intolerable to Germans, and so on. This language would, in addition, require that the primitive words of all languages be learned. This is too burdensome. Except for communicating them through writing. And it is an advantage that Descartes does not fail to recognize. It is true that if each man uses as primitive words the words of his own language, he will not have much difficulty, but in that case he will be understood only by the people of his own country unless he writes down what he wants to say and the person who wants to understand him takes the trouble to look up all the words in the dictionary, and this is too burdensome to become a regular practice. So the only possible benefit that I see from his invention would be in the case of the written word. Suppose he had a big dictionary printed of all the languages in which he wanted to make himself understood and put for each word a symbol corresponding to the meaning and not to the syllables, a single symbol, for instance, for amur, amuri, and philion, then those who had the dictionary and knew H's grammar could translate what was written into their own language by looking up each symbol in turn. But this would be no good except for reading mysteries and revelations. In other cases no one who had anything better to do would take the trouble to look up all these words in a dictionary. So I do not see that all this has much use. Perhaps I am wrong. And with a profound irony, more profound perhaps than ironical, Descartes opines that error may also result through a possible cause other than non-self-evidence, failure of attention, or an over-hasty will, a fault of reading. The value of a system of language or writing is not measured by the yardstick of intuition, of the clarity or the distinction of the idea, or of the presence of the object as evidence. The system must itself be deciphered. Perhaps I am wrong. I just wanted to write to you I could conjecture on the basis of the 6 propositions which you sent me. When you have seen the system, you will be able to say if I worked it out correctly. Deciphery. The profundity draws the irony further than it would go if it merely followed its author. Further perhaps than the foundation of Cartesian certitude. After which, in the form of note and postscript, Descartes defines the Leibnizian project very simply. It is true that he sees the story of philosophy there, only philosophy may write it, for philosophy depends on it totally, but by the same token, it can never hope to see such a language in use. The discovery of such a language depends upon the true philosophy. For without that philosophy it is impossible to number and order all the thoughts of men or even to separate them out into clear and simple thoughts, which in my opinion is the great secret for acquiring true scientific knowledge. I think it is possible to invent such a language and to discover the science on which it depends. It would make even peasants better judges of the truth about the world than philosophers are now. But do not hope ever to see such a language in use. For that, the order of nature would have to change so that the world turned into a terrestrial paradise, and that is too much to suggest outside of fairyland. 9 Leibniz expressly refers to this letter and to the analytical principle it formulates. The entire project implies the decomposition into simple ideas. It is the only way to substitute calculation for reasoning. In that sense, the universal characteristic depends on philosophy for its principle, but it may be undertaken without waiting for the completion of philosophy. However, although this language depends on the true philosophy, it does not depend on its perfection. In other words, this language can be established even if philosophy is not perfect, and as man's knowledge grows, this language will grow as well. Meanwhile, it will be a great help for using what we know, for finding out what we lack, for inventing ways of redeeming the lack, but especially for settling controversies in matters that depend on reasoning. For then reasoning and calculating will be the same thing. Point 10. To be sure, these are not the only corrections of the Cartesian tradition. Descartes' analyticism is intuitionist, that of Leibniz points beyond manifest evidence, toward order, relation, point of view. The characteristic economizes on the spirit and the imagination, whose expense must always be husband. It is the principal goal of this great science that I am used to calling characteristic, of which what we call algebra, or analysis, is only a small branch, for it is the science that gives speech to languages, letters to speech, numbers to arithmetic, notes to music. It teaches us the secret of stabilizing reasoning, and of obliging it to leave visible marks on the paper in a little volume, to be examined at leisure. Finally, it makes us reason at little cost, putting characters in the place of things in order to ease the imagination. Point 12. In spite of the differences that separate the projects of universal language or writing at this time, notably with respect to history and language. 13. The concept of the simple absolute is always necessarily and indispensably involved. It would be easy to show that it always leads to an infinitist theology and to the logos or the infinite understanding of God. Point 14. That is why, appearances to the contrary, and in spite of all the seduction that it can legitimately exercise on our epoch, the Leibnizian project of a universal characteristic that is not essentially phonetic does not interrupt logocentrism in any way. On the contrary, universal logic confirms logo of grammatology as a positive science. 79. Centrism is produced within it and with its help, exactly like the Hegelian critique to which it will be subjected. I emphasize the complicity of these two contradictory movements. Within a certain historical epoch, there is a profound unity among infinitist theology, logocentrism, and a certain technicism. The originary and pre- or metaphonetic writing that I am attempting to conceive of here leads to nothing less than an overtaking of speech by the machine. In an original and non-relativist sense, logocentrism is an ethnocentric metaphysics. It is related to the history of the West. The Chinese model only apparently interrupts it when Leibniz refers to it to teach the characteristic. Not only does this model remain a domestic representation T5, but also, it is praised only for the purpose of designating a lack and to define the necessary corrections. What Leibniz is eager to borrow from Chinese writing is its arbitrariness and therefore its independence with regard to history. This arbitrariness has an essential link with the non-phonetic essence which Leibniz believes he can attribute to Chinese writing. The latter seems to have been invented by a deaf man. New essays, loqui est voci articulata signum der cogitationis sui. Scribere est id facere permanentibus, in car deductibus. Quos ad vocem referre non est necess, ut apparit ex sinensi ern characteribus, opus Hulls, p. 49-7. Elsewhere, there are perhaps some artificial languages which are wholly of choice and entirely arbitrary, as that of China is believed to have been, or as those of George Dalgamo and the late Mr. Wilkins, Bishop of Chester. 16. In a letter to Father Bouvet, 17°3, Leibniz is bent on distinguishing the Egyptian, popular, sensory, allegorical writing from the Chinese, philosophical, and intellectual writing. Chinese characters are perhaps more philosophical and seem to be built upon more intellectual considerations, such as are given by numbers, orders, and relations, thus there are only detached strokes that do not culminate in some resemblances to a sort of body. This does not prevent Leibniz from promising a script for which the Chinese would be only a blueprint. This sort of plan would at the same time yield a sort of universal script, which would have the advantages of the Chinese script, for each person would understand it in his own language, but which would infinitely surpass the Chinese, in that it would be teachable in a few weeks, having characters perfectly linked according to the order and connection of things, whereas, since Chinese script has an infinite number of characters according to the variety of things, it takes the Chinese a lifetime to learn their script adequately. The concept of Chinese writing thus functioned as a sort of European hallucination. This implied nothing fortuitous, this functioning obeyed a rigorous necessity. And the hallucination translated less in ignorance than a misunderstanding. It was not disturbed by the knowledge of Chinese script, limited but real, which was then available. At the same time as the Chinese prejudice, a hieroglyphist prejudice had produced the same effect of interested blindness. The occultation, far from proceeding, as it would seem, from ethnocentric scorn, takes the form of an hyperbolical admiration. We have not finished verifying the necessity of this pattern. Our century is not free from it. Each time that ethnocentrism is precipitately and ostentatiously reversed, some effort silently hides behind all the spectacular effects to consolidate an insight and to draw from it some domestic benefit. The astonishing Father Kircher thus devoted his entire genius to opening the West to Egyptology. 18. But the very excellence that he recognized in a sublime script forbade any scientific deciphering of it, evoking the prodromus captus of Egypt Shakes, 1636. M.B. David writes, this work is, in some of its parts, the first manifesto of Egyptological research, since in it the author determines the nature of the ancient Egyptian language, the instrument of discovery having been furnished him from elsewhere. The same book however pushes aside all projects of deciphering the hieroglyphs. D. Lingua Egypt Shaker restituta. Here the process of non-recognition through assimilation is not, as 3 Leibniz, of a rationalistic and calculating kind. It is mystical. According to the prodromus, hieroglyphs are indeed a script, but not a script composed of letters, words, and determined parts of speech that we generally use. They are a far finer and more sublime script, closer to abstractions, which, by an ingenious linking of symbols, or its equivalent, proposes at once, uno intuitu, to the intelligence of the scholar a complex reasoning, elevated notions, or some mysterious insignia hidden in the breast of nature or the divinity. 20. Between rationalism and mysticism there is, then, a certain complicity. The writing of the other is each time invested with a domestic outline. What one might, following Bachelard, call an epistemological breach, is brought about above all by Freret and Warburton. One can make out the laborious process of disentanglement by which both prepared their decision, the former using the Chinese and the latter the Egyptian example. Of grammatology as a positive science with much respect for Leibniz and the project for a universal script, Freret cuts to pieces the representation of the Chinese script that is implied therein. Chinese script is indeed not a philosophical language which leaves nothing to be desired. The Chinese have never had anything like it. 21. But, for all that, Freret is not free of the hieroglyphist prejudice, which Warburton destroys by violently criticizing Father Kircher. 23. The apologetic purpose that animates this critique does not make it ineffectual. It is in the theoretical field thus liberated that the scientific techniques of deciphering were perfected by the Abbé Barthélemy and then by Champollion. Then a systematic reflection upon the correspondence between writing and speech could be born. The greatest difficulty was already to conceive, in a manner at once historical and systematic, the organized cohabitation, within the same graphic code, of figurative, symbolic, abstract, and phonetic elements. Asterisk speech is to give the sign of one's thought with an articulated voice. Writing is to do it with permanent characters on paper. The latter need not be referred back to the voice, as is obvious from the characters of the Chinese script.